Tēnā koutou katoa. I want to thank the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent, as we know, we'll refer to it as IFRC going forward, the Institute of Law, Emergencies and Disasters, and the United Nations Office of Disaster Risk Reduction for the opportunity to address you today as the National President of New Zealand Red Cross. I want to acknowledge the role of the University of Canterbury, who are generously hosting us over the course of this event, as well as the mana whenua of the land on which we have gathered. Kia ora. I also want to acknowledge the wide range of experts who have gathered here to share knowledge and discuss the most current issues relating to disasters law and how these intersect in the Asia-Pacific region. I'd also like to acknowledge Lianne Dalziel, who is our next speaker, who has much practical experience in this area. Being here on the ground in Christchurch today, it is almost impossible not to think of the 2010 and 2011 earthquake sequence, which led to such devastation and loss of life. Indeed, my daughter was studying law away from home at the University of Canterbury, so I have vivid memories from Auckland of that time. I am pleased to say that she stayed and successfully completed her studies here. So thank you again, University of Canterbury. In the immediate aftermath of the earthquakes, a global call for assistance was made. And in the days that follow, Red Cross and Red Crescent national societies in other countries pledged $128 million worth of support, which enabled New Zealand Red Cross to help meet the immense and immediate needs in Christchurch and broader communities impacted across Canterbury. This is the kind of global solidarity that must have been envisaged back in 1919, when the IFRC was formed to alleviate human suffering in times of peace. Our own Red Cross disaster welfare support teams have deployed numerous times in this city across the Canterbury region, including the 2010 and 2011 earthquakes, multiple severe weather events, wildfires such as the Port Hills fires in 2017 and the mosque attacks more recently. And they've been deployed across New Zealand. And I'm very pleased to say that we have a member of one of our disaster welfare support teams here today. So thank you very much. These are volunteers and they are absolutely vital to this work that New Zealand Red Cross does. In my 9 years on the national board of our national society, including the last 6 as national president, we've experienced numerous disasters here in New Zealand and across the Pacific. Just last year, a series of weather events highlighted the increasing intensity, scale, and complexity of disasters. The start of 2023 saw record-breaking rainfall and disastrous flooding in New Zealand. First, across a long weekend, there was flooding and landslips across the upper North Island in Northland, Waikato, and Auckland. Then 2 weeks later, we experienced the full force of Cyclone Gabriel, which impacted almost the entirety of the North Island. This conference and its focus on disaster law is timely as our diverse communities face these emergencies and we realise how fragile our infrastructure and supply chains can be. It will take our collective efforts to understand how to uplift our community's resilience here, at our home, at your home, and across our region. Our willingness to strengthen our arrangements and work together before, during, and after disasters becomes even more important. So the value of and reliance on underpinning legislative frameworks for disaster law is a key component and why we're all here for this conference. I am not an expert in disaster law, but I very much look forward to hearing about your research and practice and ensuing discussions, and want to thank you all for attending and sharing your research with us. Thank you.
The Honourable Lianne Dalziel, who is the former Mayor of Christchurch, Aotearoa Christchurch. She stepped down as the Mayor in having served as 9 years in that position. And prior to that, she served 23 years as a New Zealand Member of Parliament, including as a Cabinet Minister. She represented an electorate that was very hard hit by the earthquake sequence of 2010 to 2011. And she became a respected champion of resilience with a strong understanding of post-disaster challenges and opportunities. This led her to be invited to serve on the Parliamentary Advisory Group on Disaster Risk Reduction for the UN ISDR, now UNDRR, of course, while she was a Member of Parliament. Christchurch faced a number of challenges during Lianne's time as mayor, including floods, fires, and the devastating terrorist attack on the city's mosques in 2019. And I would say, and also add, and during the long drawn-out recovery process, of course, you were heavily involved in. Lianne also has a degree in law from the University of Canterbury and is a frequent speaker on a range of issues, including the importance of building community resilience, the role of leadership, and sharing lessons learned. She has a particular interest in the intersection of roles, responsibilities, and disasters, and what the law has to offer in reducing disaster risk. And from experience, Lianne, you are never short of an opinion. So I look forward to hearing your thoughts today. Thank you.
Ena mana, ena reo, e reo rangatira mā, tēnei te mihi kia koutou, I te kōpapa o te rā, tēnā koutou, tēnā rā tātou katoa. Can I also acknowledge the three organisations that have brought this conference together, the Institute of Law, Emergency and Disasters here at Canterbury University, the IFRC, much easier to summarise by its initials, and UNDRR as well. And can I also acknowledge all the sponsors who, of course, play a very important role too. It's a privilege to be able to join in the welcome to this important conference, which enables participants to consider the significance of legal frameworks in the context of disaster risk reduction, roles, responsibilities, and disasters. The three pillars of the conference focus on enabling legal frameworks to support and incentivise DRR financing, inclusive disaster risk governance, ensuring that no one is left behind in DRR efforts, and the localisation of DRR in both urban and rural contexts. Now, having had, and you've heard my background as a government minister and more recently as Mayor of Christchurch, I can attest to the importance of each of these. I was particularly pleased to see the focus on localisation and inclusion in disaster risk governance. I think they are absolutely key. Our experience here, sadly, was dominated by the imposition of a top-down decision-making process, which has had significant impacts on the city's capacity to recover as well and as quickly as it might otherwise have been. As a result, I've become an advocate for learning lessons from our experience and embedding them into practice, something that is still proving easier said than done. And I've also become an even stronger advocate for community resilience, which enables the localisation of DRR where it matters on the ground. Both require what is often described these days as radical collaboration, which I'll mention in passing as well. I've given talks on these issues over a number of years, but recently I read a book which has helped me understand the significance of these issues even more. And hopefully that's going to come up. So I don't know if anyone's read this book yet, but if you haven't, and if there is just one thing that you remember from my talk today, it is put this on your reading list. I can't pronounce Bent Flibberg's name. Dan Gardner's got a much easier name to pronounce. But it really has been quite a significant find. And it was the phrase that I've put at the top of the slide, think slow, act fast, which really summarises the key message that I've taken from it. And I guess that what it does is it extols the virtue of taking time to plan, but also to contemplate all of those scenarios that you might be faced with in a project of this particular type. And that will help you take the project on, whatever the project is, with a degree of confidence, but then you must act fast, because as they say, that then reduces the window for those sort of almost inevitable black swans to come crashing through. And so that's the concept of think fast, think slow, act fast. The trouble here was the temptation after a disaster is to do the exact opposite. You've under huge pressure to think fast because you want to get a message out to the public that this is what's going to happen next. This is the sort of reassuring message that we want to give to people, that everything is going to be all right and this is what we're going to do. That encourages decision makers to think way too fast. And I guess the message that I've taken from this book is that this is the time where you actually need to slow down, but you need to take the community with you so that they understand why time has to be taken at the beginning. So thinking slow is very important. We were thinking fast, and we ended up with a 100-day blueprint for the redesign of the central city. Can you imagine redesigning our central city in 100 days? That was an example of thinking fast. And as a result, everyone was forced to act slow as financing and delivery became increasingly challenging. So it's just, for me, the book has helped open up my eyes to the sort of lessons that I want to learn from our experience here in Christchurch, and why I want to share them with so many others. So since I'm starting with my, so putting in place a legal framework ahead of such a situation, requiring a collaborative approach to planning with the local authorities and the community would be a protection against that. So it's my advocacy for putting in place some legal frameworks in advance of something happening that would assist. Now, since I'm starting with my favourite book, I will reference the one that it superseded. Still one of my favourites. It used to get a much bigger laugh when I was the mayor. But it's such a good title, isn't it? If Mayors Ruled the World. The clue, though, is in the subtitle, Dysfunctional Nations, Rising Cities. So when the United States pulled out of the Paris Agreement, the cities said, we're here. New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, they all put their hands up, and that's where the rubber hits the road. So they were able to prove that if mayors ruled the world, how much better it would all be. But I just mention it because of the significance of cities. I attended the Sendai conference in 2015, and of course the main speakers were all representatives of governments to those that were signatories to the framework. I was a speaker at the conference, but as I was there as a city leader representing a health perspective, which was an important part of the Sendai framework. And so we were able to demonstrate, I think, that bringing cities to a leadership role within the context of some of these international frameworks actually created more opportunities for thinking about how delivery would be improved on the ground. So the delivery side of the DRR framework is invariably at a city or a district level. And I have reminded successive governments over the years that the phrase all of government, I don't know if you've all heard that phrase, all of government, it should mean all of government. Every layer of government should be included in that phrase. I've listed the attributes of the cities here that come through the book: pragmatism, civic trust, participation, indifference to borders and sovereignty. I mean, all the debate. We've come through a pandemic and the world cannot agree a pandemic agreement. Why would that be? You know, the indifference to borders and sovereignty makes more sense for delivering on the ground than some of the arguments that I've heard expressed in that debate at the World Health Assembly. Networking, creativity, innovation and cooperation. And this comes back to this word, or these words, radical collaboration. And I guess that the phrase has come about because there is a need to bring different people and different groups together to problem solve. And radical collaboration is really based on people leaving their roles and their egos at the door and really focusing on the problem at hand. No one organisation or no one person can actually address the complex issues that we are having to confront in the world today. So, returning to the importance of learning lessons, this slide is one that comes from a 2012 presentation that was actually given here at Canterbury University by Professor David Alexander, who was then the Chief Senior Scientist at the Global Risk Forum. Essentially, he says that the difference between reducing the risks of disaster or maintaining the vulnerability that's been exposed in the disaster is whether we actually learn, utilise or adopt the lessons of our experience, or whether the lessons are registered, archived, forgotten, or worse, ignored. Reviews, inquiries and reports into post-disaster recovery cannot be left to gather dust on bookshelves or left as bookmarks in a computer filing system. And I think there needs to be a well understood and embedded into practice, well, they need to be well understood and embedded into practice for the future, which is why I say that there's such an important role for organisations like IFRC and UNDRR and LEAD also, taking a lead and ensuring that these lessons are well understood and embedded into the future. And we have a lot to learn from each other in the Asia-Pacific region, and we must share these lessons. That way we can avoid, I guess, what was the somewhat cynical observation of Douglas Adams, human beings who are almost unique in having the ability to learn from the experience of others are also remarkable for their apparent disinclination to do so. And that has been repeated so many times that it very much is a truism. One of the barriers to learning the lessons of our experiences is the fear of being shown up for getting things wrong. And that's why I always use the phrase that when we look back, when we review things, we need to look back not to blame, but to understand, but to learn. So learning and understanding, that's what we want to get from reviewing what's gone wrong, but also reviewing what's gone well as well, because despite my image here, there were a lot of good things that happened as well, and I'm going to mention some of those. The government of the day, though, did set up the Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Authority. Now, it was a government department that was set up to run the city's recovery. I'm hoping that there are a lot of people in the room that can see immediately what was wrong with that idea, because it was very much a top-down approach. And I guess that the problem was that it disempowered the local council and the local communities that make up the city. The image from, and this is from the New Zealand Auditor General's report, just in case people think that I'm playing politics with it, it's not. And the report was on roles and responsibilities. And it actually shows the complexity that was created with the model that was chosen. And that's because it didn't have the community at its heart. And if it had had the community at its heart, it wouldn't have looked like that sort of pattern. And I guess that the most important lesson for me, and well supported by international evidence, was the need to strengthen and not to hollow out existing institutions and establish networks and relationships. There was a lot of good stuff that could have been drawn on in terms of what was happening in this region, and we could have built on those. And that meant that when the time came to reduce the amount of central government involvement, and I'm absolutely 100% saying that central government had to be involved, they were a major funder of what was going to happen next. They had to be involved. But when they pulled back, there was nothing left. There was a gap. There were huge gaps where the Recovery Authority had played a significant role instead of building and strengthening the role of the council and the other agencies that were already here. So, but I'm not going to dwell on that. I'm just making the point that if you start with existing institutions, organisations and community groups and build on their strengths, then in fact, you leave them better prepared for the future when the time comes for the central government to pull back. And so there is an advantage to that. One thing that I can't emphasise enough is the significance of Indigenous peoples and the traditional knowledge that they bring to the table. We actually ignore their contribution to our peril. Their ancestors knew the environment much better than the British settlers who came to our part of the world in the 19th century. Wetlands, which had been traditional food gathering areas, were drained for ever increasing urban development. We saw the consequences of that when the earthquake struck, with extensive liquefaction and land damage. The earthquake recovery legislation, and this was a very good thing and something that I would recommend very highly, was that recognised Te Runanga o Ngāi Tahu, as you've already heard, as a strategic partner. And that was a huge step forward, because not often the way things are looked at is that there is a role for the local Indigenous peoples to be involved in the recovery, but this actually brought them to the table as a strategic partner as part of the decision-making framework. And that was a big step forward. And you'll hear more about the significance of this during the conference, having read the agenda. The message here is the importance of Indigenous peoples embedding their spiritual, environmental and cultural values into the recovery objectives right from the outset. And I think this is a lesson for us all. My next message is the vital nature of public participation in decision-making. Engage the community is a simple message here. It's their recovery after all. After the earthquake, the Christchurch City Council developed a draft Central City Recovery Plan, which was based on a community engagement, which had a very simple title, Share an Idea. And it really struck a chord with the public. It was an incredible engaging way to bring the whole community together to reimagine their city centre. More than 10,000 people turned up at the stadium over a weekend and contributed their ideas on little post-it notes everywhere. There were over 100,000 ideas submitted through a variety of platforms that were available, and the council actually received an international award for co-creation. It was such a good model of engagement. But unfortunately, as I've mentioned before, the draft was replaced with this government blueprint, which went through a 100-day process behind closed doors, and there was no opportunity for any feedback afterwards. And I've often reflected that if they'd taken the chance a little bit more time and invited feedback, then actually we could have resolved some of the issues that held us up as a result of the way that it was done. But I hope hopefully these couple of examples that I've got on the next page will show you what happens when you engage the community and listen to what they have to say. So here's a not so nice little place. I heard somebody describe one of these scenes like there isn't enough Prozac in the world to make that an interesting place to be. And it is a really good description of it. That is pre-earthquake. And you can see the road and the cars parked there. And so this is when cars are more important than people. And this is what it looks like now. And this is the Riverside Market. It's a fantastic model of what councils can do with the private sector. So the Riverside development is a private development, but the road has become an incredible public shared space, which is a much better utilisation of this public realm than what it was before. And then further down the road from here, that's what it looked like. Again, the roadway is there, but now facing the river. So the whole city faces and embraces the river. And that has created a completely different environment. Again, when you put people ahead of cars, then that is the environment that you can create. And that is almost exactly the image that was created out of the share an idea process. So I guess that I'm demonstrating that there is real capacity in communities to imagine what the future might hold, and an enormous opportunity as well. Every city has and area has its own range of community leaders and networks, and every local decision maker should know who they are. So if you're thinking about creating relationships with the community after the disaster has happened, then it's too late. You want to be having those relationships strengthened and built before anything actually happens. And the way that I describe it is that it should be treated as essentially as a critical part of the city's social infrastructure in exactly the same way as we treat our physical infrastructure. We rely on our buildings, our roads and pipes being well maintained, but so must our people-to-people relationships be well maintained. They are vital to community well-being, but they're also vital in times of need for long-term recovery as well. And I'm using the example of Project Littleton. Littleton's on the other side of the Port Hills. It's a community network based on sustainability. They run a weekly farmers market, community gardens, events, waste minimisation activities, and most significantly, a time bank. You actually don't need a civil defence community group in an area that has a time bank. They already know what members of their community, what they can do, what they're prepared to do for their community, and they know that they value their time hour for hour, not dollar for dollar. And it makes such a big difference when the community is already engaged in such a positive way. So I guess we also learned in Christchurch that there will always be emergent leaders in a time of crisis, and I think that it's important to remember that, but be prepared to engage them in the decision-making loop as well. And I guess the last point that I wanted to raise is the fact that with every crisis comes opportunity. And in our case, it was an opportunity to build resilience to future challenges, especially climate change. And I guess that I often say that we experienced in a matter of seconds the impact of sea level rise predicted over 100 years as land levels dropped in some areas by a metre. The earthquakes exposed poor planning processes, and along with the underlying nature of a city built on a swamp, led to an increased vulnerability to flooding. And one of the first things that I did when I became the mayor in 2013 I did it in 2014, was to establish a multidisciplinary mayoral task force on flooding. And that was because of the flooding that you can see in the middle picture there at the top. And what the mayoral task force was able to do was it actually demonstrated what radical collaboration can do, pulling a team of people from all the different silos that normally completely have nothing to do with each other, pulling them away from the council building, bringing in others from outside, and actually developing a whole approach. We ended up with a framework for making decisions on flood protection and mitigation works, including a voluntary buyout scheme for the most vulnerable homes. And to a lot of respects, this was done below the radar because there wasn't the kind of focus on it as it has been with the storm events up in the North Island. But we were able to achieve quite a lot, but it was simply by using this model of getting people to leave their positions and their egos at the door and actually focusing on the problem and coming up with workable solutions. The government had already intervened after the earthquakes with a buyout of around 7,000 homes, which cleared a 600-hectare area of low-lying land adjacent to one of our rivers. This has made us much more resilient to flooding and has also given us the opportunity to develop and plant wetland areas, protect biodiversity, manage stormwater, and improve water quality. And I guess involving young people in community planting days, as demonstrated here, and getting them involved in wetlands restoration has been a great way to develop an intergenerational commitment to our waterways. And extensive community engagement has also helped us develop a community-led approach to coastal hazard adaptation planning with access to expert advice and support. And that's my example of never let a crisis go to waste. There's always an opportunity there if you look hard enough and you're committed enough to make it happen. So I'm finishing with this slide because this was a quote adopted as a motto by an emergent community group, the Canterbury Community Earthquake Recovery Network. And I think this expresses their utter frustration at being ignored by decision makers. They were being ignored by the council, they were being ignored by the government, the Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Authority. They just were trying to make the point that the wisdom of the community always exceeds the knowledge of the experts. You should be listening to us. And that was the message. But I've gone a little bit off from there, and I've come up with my own saying. And it's this: the wisdom of the community, when combined with the knowledge of the experts, always exceeds what one can offer without the other. And the reason that I say that is that there is so much that sits in with the science, with traditional knowledge, with and the community's experience of the environments that they live in as well, that it's absolutely vital that they come together. And so that's probably the message that I'll leave you with. A simple reminder that we need to work together collaboratively to secure a successful long-term recovery that leaves us better prepared for the challenges that we'll face in the future, a vital lesson that we must always remember. And the legal framework that pulls this all together is one that enables communities and every layer of government to come together in order to plan, taking your time to plan for how things are going to roll out in the future. So I hope that helps set the scene for some of the discussions that lie ahead. And thank you very much. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā rā tātou katoa.